And here's the deal. Well, we're going to begin. One important point is we'll start with Torah study. So we start out with a bracha, which is Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu mitzvotav v'tivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And we that's one piece by way of introduction. The next piece is our topic is, well, our source sheet is entitled LGBTQI and U. It's a Jewish Lives and Jewish Law series. And you know we've done different topics along the way. The topics from starting with things that we're doing in shul, like we talked about Zooming on Shabbat during the pandemic, and musical instruments and things like that. And tonight we're going to talk about LGBT issues in the Torah.
Do you want me, Rabbi Dan, do you want me to share the screen, or do you want to share your screen?
Are you willing?
I'm more than willing. I'm willing and able.
It's a different order of topic, right? So yes, please. It's a different type of topic in that how people live their lives is obviously of a different level of respect and seriousness than whether or not we play the guitar during Ilchad Dodi. So both are issues of halacha and both are important, but this obviously cuts a little closer and demands a certain level of thoughtfulness and respect, and that's one thing. The other thing is we're dealing with sensitive topic that's through all of that deals with different areas of Jewish history and Jewish life. There's no way you're going to get through tonight without hearing something that you disagree with. This is the trigger warning. We're going to quote different sources from with different perspectives. So just be ready for that. And also, this is for mature audiences, which is to say, there may be parts that are relatively graphic.
Right. It's definitely not a PG. It's a PG-13 or higher rating. And we will discuss matters of intimacy with delicacy and gentleness and kindness and understanding. But do know that if there is someone in the room with you that you don't want that to hear those things, just consider that.
Yep. And with that, do I start out?
Okay. I think so. I have that you do the Klal Gadol.
Oh yeah. So we are.
Before we start, though, I actually do want to put another sort of not caveat, but two things. One, we will have a moderator again. So if there are questions that come up, please do put them in the chat and they will be curated into questions together. And then the second one is some of the language that is used. Now, Rabbi Dan and I were just talking about this, that good allyship for any minority group, the language and vocabulary changes, right? Something as simple as my dad grew up calling people Oriental and now you call people Asian. Things are Oriental, people are Asian. So these sorts of terms don't always, so the sources that we're looking at may or may not keep up with some of that. There may be assumptions made in terms of language that we may not use today. So just to also put that little wrapper and caveat on what we look at, and that, what we're doing again is treating subjects that may have some sensitivity to them with as delicate and gentle a hand as we can. And we may not always get it right, but our intention is to do so. So those two things, again, questions that you want to put into the chat, please do. Thank you, Rabbi Dan.
And so we're just starting with the lens through which we and I read everything, which is the introductory piece that's on your screen. From Bereshit Rabbah, comment from Genesis 5:1. Benazai teaches that these are the generations of Adam is a great principle of Torah, or the underlying principle of Torah, or the general, the organizing idea of Torah is how I generally understand it. Rabbi Akiva says, That love your neighbor as yourself, that's the organizing principle of the Torah. Now, these are the generations of Adam. That's a line before all the begats, where they taught, and the Ben Azai's idea is that all of humanity comes from the same source, and that is how you're supposed to read the entire Torah. I always understand it as a lens issue, that the lens that you're supposed to read the entire Torah with is this. Either that their debate is it that we all sort of have equal claim as to being close to God or equal claim to dignity, or is it that we're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself? And they don't resolve the difference, but that those are the lenses we're supposed to use, and that is true here as well. The idea being that if you are reading something counter to that, you're reading it wrong, because the principle that we have as readers of the Jewish tradition, Torah writ large, are these. So that's one thing.
Right. So that if you're, just to put it another way, if your interpretation of Torah leads you to be cruel to another human being, you're not reading it the right way. So these sorts of places, not saying that any of us do this or anyone we know does this, but any sort of religious attitude that shames and harms people violates this overarching principle.
Almost like unnecessarily. Obviously, there are places where people get killed in the Torah, and that's not frowned upon in the least, right? So on the context. So the key verses that we end up talking about, and that we want to talk about tonight, there are two verses in the Torah that are really the focus of much of the discussion around homosexual behavior in Torah, both from Vayikra, both in the section of prohibitions where God says that you should be holy, don't imitate the practices of the land of Canaan that I'm bringing you to. And then there's a long list of things, most of which are prohibitions of incest. Don't lie with your stepdaughter and things like this, or with your aunt and what have you. And then near the end of them, it says, "Zachar lo tishkav ad mishkavei isha toivati." Do not lie with a male as one lies with a man as one lies with a woman. It's an abhorrence. Don't lie with a man the lyings of a woman. It is an abhorrence, or a you can translate toiva different ways, but
and you can also translate the "as one lies with," that will come up later. So what that means exactly, and is it go on. Sorry.
So and Isha Sher Yishkav Zakar Mishkavei Isha Toiva Tatsu Shnehem Moti Matu Devehavam. A man lies with a male as one lies with a woman. The two of them have done an abhorrence. So what we're going to do is think of what is the saying and why is it saying it. There are different opinions as to what these are saying, why are they saying it, what's the prohibition, and does it, Rabbi Sisi is fond of quoting Gershwin's.
Oh, it ain't necessarily so. The things that you're liable to read in the Bible, it ain't necessarily so. Which, by the way, is the tune to the Haftarah blessing, or the Torah blessings. It ain't necessarily so. Baruch hu et Adonai hamvorach. It's where they got that from. Fun fact. Go on.
Catchy tune. So that's I said. So those are the main things that you got to keep in mind. Those verses. Those are the verses under discussion. Should we and I'll throw it back to you, though. I'll also put maybe the link to the sheet in the chat in case.
So the next part is you. I think you're still up. But
am I still up?
while you're doing that is the other piece also, just wanted to put out there again with my one caveat about terminology and language and whatnot. The Bible, the Torah itself specifically does deal with homosexuality, male with male intercourse and interactions and relations. I want to also just say that the Torah and the sources sort of presume a traditional gender binary. So you will hear things like male versus female, and there isn't a sense of other gender identities in the traditional sources. We can talk a little bit at the end about what that means in terms of there are two different things we're looking at: sexual orientation, who you're attracted to, versus gender identity, what your gender identity is: male, female, trans, gender nonconforming, all of those things. We're more specifically going to look at sexual orientation tonight. But I want to just put that out there. And when Rabbi Dan says homosexuality, we are specifically talking about, at least in the biblical texts when we get to them, male intercourse, not female, but that will come up later. So just keep that in mind. Gender binary is presumed, even though modern scholarship, we don't necessarily presume there to be a binary. We're not talking about identity in the sex sense of transgender and those things tonight. We're talking mostly about sexual orientation, which is to whom you are attracted, whether you are gay, lesbian, bisexual, and incidentally, another binary that is presumed by most of the sources we're looking at is gay or straight. That bisexuality doesn't really come in to these sources that we're going to look at tonight.
Yeah, the rabbis have any number of references to them. I think we're ahead of the game on class with the most disclaimers.
Yeah. Yeah. For those who also don't know, I don't mean to keep jumping in, but I do also want to put out, for 2 years when I was in rabbinical school, from my last 2 years of rabbinical school, I had an internship at Congregation Beit Simchat Torah in New York City, which is an LGBTQI plus synagogue. And it was a fantastic internship. I was almost like an assistant rabbi in those days. And I learned a tremendous amount about being a rabbi, but also about allyship and how to best support the LGBTQ plus community. So this is sort of one of my areas of bread and butter. So I'm happy to talk about them. To Rabbi Dan probably wants me to talk a little less. So I'm going to let him go on.
So where we're going to start is what the Torah says and what that means for Judaism aren't always the same thing. So we're going to go along to a couple of different tracks here. Now, if you're familiar with halakha, with the decision-making on Jewish law, what the Torah says is often less significant than how the Jewish tradition reads what the Torah says. And the idea, my governing presumption for the conversation is that, probably it's unlikely that many people on within the sound of my voice are comfortable just throwing out just saying that the Torah prohibits being gay or homosexuality or gay sex or whatever it might be, and so be it, right? But most people probably aren't in that category. So if you have a troubling line, like the lines in Leviticus that say something that might rub the wrong way, what do you do with it? So what we're going to do is look through Jewish history initially at a few different spots on seeing what the Jewish tradition does with troubling text. What did our ancestors do when they ran into a text that they, I think, morally felt that they couldn't quite deal with as written? The first one we're going to look at, we're going to do this relatively quickly, meaning that you could do an entire class on these things, but we're not. If you want this class, please tell me. I'd be totally happy to teach it. The one is how the rabbis, the sages, would implement a law differently than its original meaning. Here, the first example we have here is from the book of Devarim, from Deuteronomy, the rebellious child. Remember this? If you show up at shul, it pops up at the beginning of, where is it? Kitavo. If somebody has a disobedient and defiant son, the Torah says, who does not obey his father or his mother and does not obey them, even after they discipline him, his father and his mother shall take hold of him and bring him to the elders of the town in front of his community. They shall say to the elders of the town, our son is disloyal and defiant. He does not listen to us. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then the men of the town shall stone him to death. So here we have the case of the wayward and defiant son who gets stoned to death. So what do the rabbis do with this? This is one of the classic examples where the rabbis will spend 4 pages in the Talmud. Those of you who have been studying Talmud with me since October, you know that we've made it through, I think, 3 pages. So they spend 4 pages of the Talmud, which is a lot. Essentially reading this and putting limitations on the text. They define, well, what does it mean if it's a son? If it's a minor son, is this true? No, well, clearly minors aren't responsible for what they say the way somebody who's of age does, but does it mean me? Like, can I not insult my parents? I'm 47 years old. Like, well, clearly it doesn't mean me because I'm a grown up. Like, and they define it down. Oh, well, it's after puberty begins, but before he's independent and on his own. They keep narrowing it down. And finally they get to this piece in Sanhedrin 71a after, this is towards the end of their discussion. After putting lots of limitations on this piece where they were uncomfortable with the idea of stoning to death rebellious children. Because Rabbi Yehuda is saying that the boy's mother must be identical to his father in several aspects. This is also taught if they took this from the Koran Science Al Tanakh. So the bold print is the translation of the Talmud text. The light print is the 21st century editor is sort of making it read more smoothly. This is also taught in a Braita, meaning another source from the time of the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda says, the mother was not identical to his father in voice, appearance, and height. He does not become a stubborn and rebellious son. Talmud asks, really? What's the reason for that? Because the verse says, he will not obey our voices, kolenu, which indicates that if they have our voices, it means that their voices should be identical. They should be identical in voice, in appearance, and height. They should look the same. It should be, if it's us, it has to be us as in ways that you wouldn't be able to discern one from the other. So after all of these limitations from things like, well, he has to have been warned and he has to have witnesses and he has to be of a certain age, they get to this almost impossible level of specificity that the mother and father have to have the same style of voice and height and look. Not easy to achieve. So the Gemara says, you know what? In line with this, it was taught in a Braita again in a teaching from the time of the Mishnah, there has never been a stubborn and rebellious son, meaning as defined by the Torah, as defined by the sages, and there never will be one in the future. Because it'd be impossible to fulfill all these crazy requirements rabbis put on it. So if it never was, which is a historical statement, and it never will be, which is sort of a statement of we have legislated this out of existence, why is it that it's even there? And they say, by studying it, you're doing a mitzvah. And when you do a mitzvah, God approves, you gain reward from heaven, as it were, when you study mitzvah. So it never was, and it never will be. But it's there for us to study. Now, this is significant because, obviously, was it the intention of the author of the Torah, uppercase A or lowercase a, as you like, that this be the case, that they wrote it there in order so that you never do it? Well, if you were a historian, if you were teaching in university, you would say, well, probably not. Probably it was there as a law to punish disobedient and defiant sons. So what have the rabbis done? They've taken something that they disagreed with, and they essentially legislated it out of existence. And we're bringing this partly to say that, obviously, you know where we're going with this. We're not going to come back and say, and so at the end, it's forbidden for anyone to be gay. We're not, we're not going that direction. And part of the reason we're bringing this is to say that when we do that, we're not just being modern liberals who throw out anything we disagree with. There's a long Jewish tradition of taking something that you morally disagree with and leaving the text of the Torah as is, but reading it differently. So that's one thing. They've interpreted this line out of existence, and what's more, said that it could never be any different. It will never be applicable. The second text, shorter, is sort of famously an eye for an eye. The law of an eye for an eye appears 3 times in the Torah. This is in Exodus, next week's parsha, in Leviticus, this one, and also in Deuteronomy. There's the one from Leviticus. If anyone kills a human being, he shall be put to death. He should make restitution for it. If an animal hits him, he should make restitution for it, life for life. If anyone maims his fellow, and he has, Rabbi Sisi, I think your cursor is blocking part of the time.
Sorry about that.
He has
So
done so, it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The injury inflicted on another shall be inflicted on him. Rashi's comment on this is that our rabbis, quoting from the Talmud, explain that this does not mean the actual infliction of a blemish, but that it is monetary compensation. We estimate the injured individual's value as a slave, and the offender has to pay the difference between his value as an unnamed man and what he represents after the infliction of the injury. So this is from the beginning. The rabbis would read eye for an eye out of existence because it seems because they disagreed with it. Now, if you believe the oral law came from Mount Sinai, you'd say that it was always this way. If you don't believe that, you'd say that, oh, wait a minute, what happens here? They're faced with an ancient text that is more harsh than they want it to be. And they read it differently. Oh, when it says an eye for an eye, that means the monetary value of an eye for an eye. When it says life for life, it means the monetary value of that life. How do we know that? Well, they would go down to the slave market and figure it out. So the Torah says something directly, and they read it out of existence. They read it as monetary value rather than actual wound for wound or tooth for tooth. So that's step one. How do you deal with troubling texts? Well, the rabbis would interpret them in ways that they didn't find troubling. Rabbi.
So okay. So as we put up in our little source sheet here, if you're looking on the screen with us, I called this the halachic toolbox. Now, Rabbi Eli Spitz, who we also heard about in our last session, also wrote about music on Shabbat, wrote this cool thing, and I actually didn't realize that it was the same person that I got this idea from the halachic toolbox. Imagine you have a toolbox. So Rabbi Dan, you want to use the most precise tool you have, but you have other tools, like, right, you want to put a hole in the wall. Sometimes you take a hammer and a nail. Sometimes take a sledgehammer and bash it in. I'm a big fan of the HGTV renovation shows. So you're not going to use a hammer when whatever you need to get rid of is really big. And there is an idea that there's more than one thing you're going to want to do halachically with Jewish law with pieces of text and pieces of Torah and pieces of legislation. So we just looked at the one that takes care of with a very small hole, right? This is you make it so that that's procedurally inoperable. And the two ways that we've done it is the overarching tool number one is interpretation. And so the interpretation can be either, as we saw here, interpreting narrowly, so narrowly that it's interpreted out of existence. Plus, as Rabbi Dan indicated, with the rebellious child, there's this moment where they say, and by the way, even when we narrowed the case, it's never going to happen, right? And then the second one, as you saw, was interpreting non-literally. So we have interpretive tools, and we're going to apply them to our Leviticus verses in a moment. But before we do that, we have there's two other tools that I just sort of want to touch on. And there could be a case made that, right, if you have a wall that is disintegrating, you're not going to just cut out little tiny holes in that wall, in my HGTV flipping this house analogy. You're going to take the sledgehammer and knock down that wall and put a new one in, right? Or if you want an open concept house, you're going to do that, right? So the idea is there is a time and a place for larger changes to come into play. Okay, so this one is rendering a law procedurally inoperable. Is the second largest of our toolkit. Hang on, I'm just getting my notes. Okay. So we have here, our example is capital punishment. So what does it say here? Many times in the Talmud, a biblical law was made inoperable by a procedural decision. While the sages were careful not to actually uproot, that's coming next, the biblical law in these cases, the outcome was essentially the same. The law was no longer in effect. And the example that I wanted to bring is one of capital punishment. There's a lot of stuff that you can die for in the Torah, right? You can be put to death for. And the rabbis weren't necessarily so keen on actually implementing that. Capital punishment is messy, and I'm sure there were opponents to it in the biblical days as well, right? So the rabbis were uncomfortable carrying out capital punishment. To do so was contingent upon the Sanhedrin, that's the legal court of the day, meeting in their usual place for hearing cases. By moving their location, a procedural act, they could no longer impose capital punishment, because as they understood it, a court could only do so when all 23 individuals in the Sanhedrin met on the temple grounds. no longer meeting there. They couldn't hear capital cases, so nobody got capital punishment. So this was the second piece. This is the bigger hole. They're making a bigger hole, saying we don't want to do this. We're gonna make it procedurally inoperable. We're not narrowly interpreting it like we just did in our first tool. This tool, we're gonna be a little bit broader. We're gonna make it so we can't implement it at all, right? There's no case where we're gonna implement capital punishment because we're not meeting where we can do it. So here the rabbis acted in such a way as to no longer be able to render capital cases and explain their reasoning on ethical grounds. So this is also important for what we're doing here, is that there was an ethical consideration, right? I think Rabbi Dan said this at the beginning, and we talk about whether we have musical instruments on Shabbat. Nobody's essential life's worth is in question or identity is questioned. It's not a human rights concern. We can have differing opinions on whether or not it's good for the service, but it doesn't impinge on someone's basic human rights. So here there's a moral concern with capital punishment. And then again, when we get to our issues of gay involvement in Jewish life. Okay. All right. So concerned that there was a prevalence of murders about, they feared that they would be so inundated as to be unable to render fair decisions. Based on their moral and ethical concerns, they found a way to avoid carrying out the biblical commandment to implement capital punishment at all. Okay, so here we have in Mishnah Makot, a Sanhedrin that executes a transgressor once in 7 years is characterized as a destructive tribunal, once in 7 years. Since the Sanhedrin would subject the testimony to exacting scrutiny, it was extremely rare for a defendant to be executed. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, this is for a Sanhedrin that executes a transgressor once in 70 years, right? So they're even making it even more rare. Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva say, if we had been members of the Sanhedrin, no person would have ever been executed. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, in adopting that approach, they too would increase the number of murders among the Jewish people, right? So what's their concern? It's right. It's like, killing people is the answer to killing people, right? There's a moral concern that the rabbis have with this. And so what do they do for our purposes? One, we wanted to bring you these texts because it's nice to learn new texts, but along the way, you're also learning that there's another way to say, we don't like this so much, right? Again, right back to what Rabbi Dan started the introduction with. We don't read the Torah literally. The Gershwin boys were right. It ain't necessarily so. And there are lenses through which we interpret. And it's not willy-nilly. There are concerns. And when there is a moral ground, we take our role very seriously in terms of how we interpret things.
That we made sure to keep in Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel's dissent, right? So this is part of the key of all of Jewish teaching, right? It's even when there's a majority view, which is the first one in that Mishnah, there's a dissent there at the end.
Right. And that's another piece that's really important to know. Even in modern Jewish law, we preserve the dissenting opinions on this subject of gays and lesbians in Judaism and the conservative movement. There are 3 teshuvot, 3 responsa, and one of them was not adopted by the Committee for Jewish Law and Standards, our body for making these decisions, but yet I've read it, right? That is not even one that has been recorded in our, quote unquote, sort of Talmud, but it's still important to hold on to these values because the dissent is always important. I was a student of history. Dialectics fascinate me, right? I hone my opinion by hearing the opposite side's opinion. And I love that Judaism embraces that. Okay, that's a side note. All right, so this is our second. Rabbi Dan, just keep an eye on, people are coming still into the waiting room. I've just been letting them in while you were teaching. Just if you can keep an eye on that, just to make sure people don't miss stuff. So that's number 1. Now, that was number 2. Our third tool, which is used extremely rarely, akira, uprooting it from the Torah. This is, you want an open concept living room, dining room, and you knock the wall down completely and you don't put anything back in its place. And there's no way around it. If you want that open concept, you are going to have to rip down that wall. And there is a case to be made that there is a reason that can happen in Jewish law as well. Okay, so there are two sources here. Rabbi Chia bar Abba replied in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, "It is better that a letter be rooted out of the Torah than that the divine name shall be publicly profaned." And this is in reference to why a story in Samuel seems to contradict a law in Deuteronomy. If breaking a mitzvah causes God to be glorified, then it's permissible to do so. So he's saying, they're making a case. These are the rabbis, not Rabbi Dan and Rabbi Sisi. These are the dudes, right? And they all were dudes. But these are the guys who say that it's better to take a letter out of the Torah, right? The most sacred piece of scroll of writing we have, of teaching we have, it's better to take a letter out of that than to let the divine name be profaned by keeping that letter in. And I will tell you that there are those who, when we get to interpreting the Leviticus piece in homosexuality, there are those that argue, and I'm not saying it's a majority view, by the way, but there are those that argue that this is a place where the divine name is profaned by keeping this hurtful line in the Torah. So I want you to just sort of entertain the idea that that's a possible way that we as Jewish people in 2021 could deal with this. We don't. We punchline. We're going to go back to interpreting and using the hammer and the nail. We're not going to rip the whole wall out. But there's a case to be made that maybe we could. Okay? So this is part one. Then Menachot, another piece of Talmud. Sometimes the cancellation of Torah is its foundation, and this is based on the beautiful idea that of the sacredness of the fragments, that the broken tablets that Moses broke when he saw what we remember were dancing around the golden calf, and all of that was happening, and Moses smashes the commandments. He carries those around in the ark with him. The Jewish people carry those around because the brokenness has holiness as well, and so here, the foundation of Torah, right? From those broken pieces comes the rest of the Torah. There is something really beautiful and so there's precedent for what we're calling akira. Okay, it's infrequently used, but it is used nonetheless. Let's see.
You know the best way to deal with psychos? Silent treatment. We should draw him out.
Somebody is off of mute. Okay. Yeah. Sorry about that. Just guys, watch your mute buttons. It's all good. Okay. So, I have more to say on this. It's a mechanism from, changing circumstances. The other one that we didn't really talk about that I always love to cite, that I'll just bring in at this point is, again, it's more of an interpretive piece, but the case of the deaf mute. If in a society where your intellect was judged by your capacity for understanding was judged by your ability to speak and converse, if you couldn't speak and converse, you were considered incapable of understanding. So in that world, you were then no longer obligated to perform mitzvot, because if you can't understand your creator, you can't have an aliyah, you can't do all of these things. But then there was, along the way, people had a better understanding of a person who was deaf mute. It's not their capacity to understand that has been impacted. It is their capacity to speak. And there are other measures for intellect and understanding. So again, there's such a rich history of how we approach Torah being affected by moral reading and changing circumstances and understanding of things. Last year, remember way back before the pandemic, we did a teaching on women and mitzvot. And again, the idea of what a woman's role was in society has changed, that women work outside of the home. Women are full-fledged members of society in a way that they might not have been at the time of the rabbis. So with that changing idea of a person's status came changing ideas of their role in religious life as well. Okay, so there are all these different tools that we can use. So what are they? Interpretation, rendering it procedurally inoperable, and ripping it out completely. And all three of them are valuable tools in dealing with troubling, problematic pieces of Torah teaching. Okay, I think that's me. Okay.
Right. Now, the next section is, so those are how the rabbis dealt with troubling texts. For most of history, this next section is, these texts were not troubling, or weren't troubling to the mainstream Jewish community, really, in ways that we can detect. These were prohibitions that seems questioned or doubted. In fact, they were expanded. Again, if the lines in Leviticus you see there again, Zachar lo tiskava mishkana isha toivati. You may not lie with a man the lyings of a woman. It is an abhorrence. That seems to be talking about, well, what it's talking about we'll continue to figure out. At the very least, it seems to be one specific thing. How do the rabbis read it? There are a few different ways. First, I'm going to look at the bit from Sifra. This is the halachic midrash on Leviticus, early from the Tannaitic times, from the time of the Mishnah, roughly. That whole chapter, chapter 18, begins with this great line. So, I am Adonai your God. K'maseh eretz Mitzrayim asher yishavtam ba lo ta'asu. K'maseh eretz Canaan asher ani me'evi etchem shama lo ta'asu. You shall not copy the practices of the land of Egypt where you dwelt, or the land of Canaan to which I'm taking you, nor shall you follow their laws. My rules alone shall you observe, and faithfully follow my laws. I am Adonai your God. So the rabbis ask, should not follow the acts of the land of Egypt and the acts of the land of Canaan. So is it conceivable that the Israelites should not build buildings or plant plantings? Like, sort of like, wait a minute, what do you mean here? You shouldn't do like the Egyptians do. The Egyptians build buildings. Does that mean we can't build buildings? The Canaanites plant fields. I mean, we can't plant fields. Like, what does it mean? Don't do what they do. Like, how can that possibly be? So it's not. So that's their question. They set up their question so they can give their answer. The answer is no. It says, don't do their practices, and it goes very specifically. This is then the line that's followed by all of these lists of primarily sexual prohibitions. Most of them have to do with incest, though not all. There's also a prohibition on sleeping with a woman who is a menstruant. And there's also, who's menstruating, and there's also a prohibition on bestiality. There are also our line from here. So what does it mean when it says you should not talk about their practices? It says, the rabbis read this as saying, I, God, have declared prohibited only the practices that they and their ancestors established. And what do they mean? Rabbis say, well, a man would marry a man, and a woman would marry a woman, and a man would marry a woman and her daughter, and a woman would be married to two men. Regarding these, it said, do not follow their practices. So I brought this text in. There are any number of things. There are a few things where you could bring where it shows sort of like that the rabbis read these verses as a prohibition on homosexuality, sort of like in general as a behavior. And this is one of those indications. The traditional read isn't narrow, which is what you could get out of this line, that it is prohibiting like a specific act. Don't lie with a male as one lies with a woman. Like, it seems that it's a specific act that's being done. They're reading this very broadly, that it's has to do with a lot more than just one act. They can't get married. They're doing these other things. Does the Torah say this? No. This is how the rabbis read it. What isn't there in Leviticus, as you know, is if you notice, both lines from Leviticus deal exclusively with males. Every actor in both of those verses is a male. It doesn't deal with same-sex relationship with women. So the Talmud will mention that. Maimonides codifies it into law. Sometimes we'll bring Maimonides for his Mishnah Torah, just because he'll say it. He'll take the same thing that the Talmud says. He'll just say it a little more clearly. And this is how he defines it: women who rub one against the other, as forbidden. This is in the section talking about prohibited sexual practices and permitted sexual practices. So that's what he's talking about. He's not talking about back rubs here. This is sexual rubbing. This is forbidden. Women run one against the other. It's among the acts of Egypt against which we were warned, for it says, "You shall not copy the practice of the land of Egypt." The sages said, what is it they would do? A man would marry a man, a woman would marry a woman would marry two men, the same thing, right, that we just read. Even though this practice is prohibited, one does not receive lashes, meaning the rabbinic court can't physically punish you with whippings for that. There's no specific biblical prohibition. It is not called intercourse at all. This is the other thing. All right, so I get to handle it because this is here. We're talking about who gets to do this. It's that when it says a man should not lie with a man the lyings of a woman. What are the lyings of a woman? It seems to be that that the biblical understanding of what is intercourse. We're all old enough to remember the Clinton years. This was 2 impeachments ago. The Clinton-Lewinsky scandal involved like sort of these questions of like, well, what's sex? What's intercourse? What is it? What isn't it? Like, what qualifies? What doesn't qualify? I mean, it qualified, but here the issue is to the Bible, and notice to Maimonides, even 2,000 years later, intercourse, what lesbian sex is not intercourse to them because it doesn't involve a penis. This is the bottom line, is that the lyings of woman seems to be penetration with a penis. And the rabbis will talk about it, they're below the waist essentially, right? So leaving Bill Clinton aside, like there are 2 ways it can happen with them. One is what they call kadarko, which is vaginal intercourse. The other is low kadarko. So the usual way, the not usual way. So vaginal intercourse, anal intercourse, right? So this is what the rabbis, what almost universally it seems they think these verses in Leviticus mean when they talk about the lyings of a woman, that the lyings of a woman is how intercourse, how a woman experiences intercourse, penetrative intercourse, which is a penis inside of her. Then, so that you should not lie with a man. The lyings of a woman is specifically that act between 2 men, meaning anal sex. So the verses in Leviticus seem to prohibit that specific act. Maimonides points out, and the rabbis of the Talmud are like, well, why doesn't it prohibited? Why isn't lesbian sex prohibited? Well, it just doesn't qualify for them. That sort of Clinton era question of like, well, what is sex? What isn't sex? It's just not sex. They say it's not called, in my mind, it's not called intercourse at all. Therefore, they're not prohibited from marrying into the priesthood on account of prostitution. A woman is not prohibited to her husband on account of this. Meaning, again, if a woman, if she sleeps with somebody who's not her husband, they're prohibited to each other. But if she's doing this, i.e., with another woman, it doesn't disqualify her because it just wasn't intercourse.
Which is a little, honestly, a heteronormative and a paternalistic problem, right? That, in 2020, if you said that to 2 women who are, having relations with each other, they would laugh at you because they're doing stuff that, these rabbis just didn't know. Right.
So this is right. So this is just their legal definition is this is what's qualified for, right? Whether or not it's ours now is a totally different matter. In fact, the Talmud, calls it mere licentiousness, mere licentiousness, meaning that it's like this isn't the way you're supposed to behave, but like it's not a crime the way this other thing, which is, look at the Leviticus 20, gets you the death penalty. This is merely what you're not supposed to be doing. Maimonides does say they should get lashes, but they're not biblical lashes mandated by the Bible. They're just rabbinic lashes, which hurt less. I don't know. It's a lesser level. It's thought of as a lesser level of punishment.
But luckily, because of the Sanhedrin, we're not doing capital punishment anyway, so you're okay.
So I just brought this in. So one, know that the prohibition is sort of like wasn't limited to what the verses seem to talk about, but it was expanded. And female same-sex relationships were prohibited by the rabbis, but they seem to understand it as not being a biblical prohibition. It's somewhat controversial as to whether or not they thought of it as a biblical prohibition or not, but probably not. The last text I want to bring from a traditional perspective that often is brought into these discussions because of our language, English, which has a specific word of sodomy, right? Sodomy referring to anal sex, right? Like and that obviously comes from the story of Stone, but as I think I point this out in shul frequently when we get to this part. For those of you who are regulars there, just read the piece there, right? Lot's visitors had not yet lain down when the townspeople, the men of Stone, young and old, all the people to the last man gathered around the house, and they shouted to Lot and said to him, "Where are the men you who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may be intimate with them." Yada, they're using yada, like to know. Despite the fact that that English uses the word sodomy for that, whether or not it's a polite word to use or not, the fact that the word's out there, clearly what the story indicates isn't, it's not talking about it's not talking about anything besides rape. What the men of Stone are proposing, and what the crime they're guilty of is rape, not anal intercourse. So the word as it's used in English is sort of misleading as to whether or not that story in the Bible prohibits it. That story in the Bible seems to not think of it in terms of that, and in fact, all of later rabbinics sees the sin of Stone as that they were rude to their visitors in a pretty extreme way, and not that they were what we would call gay. So that story and its parallel in Judges 19 are about rape, not about homosexual intercourse or same-sex relations. Those are something totally different. So those are traditional views. We'll fast forward to different contemporary reads of this. Rabbi.
Yes. Thank you. So don't worry, Rabbi Dan isn't the only one that will talk about uncomfortable things. I get to do that now too. But the Sodom is a really good transition segue into this, because the issue with Lot's, the visitors, and what happened in Sodom is not, as you said, anal intercourse, although it involved that, but that wasn't the problem. The problem was the coercive and forceful nature of that intercourse. That was what was forbidden. I mean, in all ways, what is the sin of Sodom? They didn't practice hachnasat orchim. Well, they didn't welcome their guests. They were pretty everything but welcoming. So their coercion and forceful nature, their rape, is what is the issue. So I'm going to bring in two contemporary interpretations of these verses. Now, one of the things I really love, I don't know if you've learned this yet, is biblical grammar, is grammar generally. And some of the interpretive tools in the halachic toolbox that I keep referring to when you're taking the interpretation piece is grammar. You're tweaking the grammar, you're looking at the grammar. And one thing we love to do is look at other verses. So what I'm about to do in the meat of this section is I'll bring in other verses like Rabbi Dan did to sort of show you what things mean in those verses and come up with what is an interpretation that is viable and does what we want, what our end goal is to do, which is to honor creation and honor gay and lesbian and bisexual and all sorts of people for who they are, and that their loving relationships are potentially not a loving homosexual relationship is not necessarily forbidden by the Bible. One thing that I also, Rabbi Dan, touched on was the difference between being gay versus anal intercourse, like the act versus the, hate the sinner versus the sin kind of language. Some people go down that route. The rabbis pretty clearly seem to say that the whole lifestyle is a problem. But one way of dealing with this is to say, we don't ask what you do in your bedroom. You guys can be two gay men together. We're not going to ask. That's not the approach we're trying to take here with this law, because it is clear that the rabbis sort of do say that it is the lifestyle that is a challenge. The other thing you could say is, well, you obviously can't lie with a man the way you lie with a woman. It's just not physically possible. That's also not the level of interpretive work we're doing. We're doing something a little more deep. So there's going to be moments where I'm going to talk about grammar and the Hebrew, and I'll do my best to explain it. And if I'm not doing the greatest of job, put it in the chat and I'll let you know what I meant. Okay. So Two modern rabbinical interpretations that I'm going to bring that seek to similarly narrow and redefine our Leviticus verses the way that we did with the rebellious child and the eye for an eye. Rabbi Stephen Greenberg, he's sort of the go-to on this. There are many people after him, but he's one of the sort of groundbreaking Orthodox theologian and rabbi who is also gay. A book called Wrestling with God and Man, which is a reference to Jacob, who wrestles with God and men. So his take on this is the following: he seeks to interpret the verse very narrowly, focusing on the nature of the sexual relationship between two males. Right. So ve'et zachar lo tishkav mishkevei isha, and with a man don't do lyings of a woman. It is an abomination. Coupled with the second version of this law, that if a man lies with a male, and it says man and male, the words are different there in the verse. In Hebrew, it says isha and then zachar. As one lies with a woman, the two of them have done an abhorrence. So that the first, so he's going to tell us that what is going on here because of the word tishkav, the mishkaveh, the word that is used for the sex here is one of several different words in the Bible that are used for sexual intercourse. The word he's using he's going to make the argument that it's mostly exclusively used in coercive, forced rape situations. So he's going to make the argument that this is about a particular kind of rape and not a consensual, loving relationship. That's the short version. Okay, so what does he say? The verses prohibit an assertive, coercive sexual act where one is forcing himself on another. Now, incidentally, and Greenstein, when we get to the second interpretation, there's also a sense of you shouldn't do this to women either, right? The idea here is we've just had this whole list, and Rabbi Dan will get to this at the end, but it bears mentioning here. We this whole list of forbidden acts of sex in Leviticus. And the whole thing is it's all coercive, it's all a power dynamic, it's all, back to the Clinton imagery that you brought up before. Part of Clinton's issue is that he's a man in power and an intern, right? And so those kinds of things, there's a strong case to be made that the Torah is trying to prohibit using sex as a power tool. Not toolbox power tool, but you know what I mean. Okay, so where one is forcing himself on another. If the act is a loving, consenting one, however, it is not what is prohibited by these verses, but rather something holy. He writes, and this is Greenberg, the verse in Leviticus 18 might reasonably be prohibiting the use of penetrative sex as a tool of humiliation and domination, while leaving open the acceptance of a committed, loving relationship between two men. My proposed, albeit radical, interpretation of Leviticus 18:22 is then, and this is his translation, which is different than the JPS one we have brought before. And a male you shall not sexually penetrate to humiliate. It is abhorrent. He is making the case that mishkaveh isha, as one lies with a woman, is in a humiliating, powerful way. That is what he is interpreting that to mean. And he draws on several sources, including the ones below, to demonstrate two things. And we'll look at those sources. First, that when the word mishkaveh, lyings, that word for sex, is used, it is used in a power-asserting way. And second, that penetrating a man as one would a woman against his will was seen as punishment. Okay, so this is what Greenberg says. And these are the two things that he's drawing on. When we're talking about Reuben gets a blessing at the end of Genesis by his father, Jacob. It's not such a good, Yes, Jacob. Sorry, I got my generations mixed up for a second. Jacob, it's not the greatest of blessings. And he says, Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and the beginning of my strength, the excellency of dignity and the excellency of power. Unstable as water you shall not excel, because you went up to your father's bed, then defiled you it, and when you went up to my couch. And the word here, he has sex with one of his father's wives. Mishkeveh avicha. So again, the lyings of your father. Here is another place where he did something that was coercive and inappropriate. Okay, the word is being used in. This word for sex is not the only word for sex, and when it is used elsewhere in the Bible, it informs us of how it is meant to be interpreted. Second one, this is not from the Bible. This is, again, Midrash kind of source. Pharaoh was one of 4 men or kings who made themselves into gods, and thus were penetrated like women, and they were Hiram, Nebuchadnezzar, Joash, and Pharaoh. So he's saying that here, that again, the word mishkav is used. Where is it? Anyway, it's like, kinashim, that's where he's using it. So again, as with women, that these guys were in the story, it's a little bit complicated, but they're basically treated like women. Again, women, to treat a man like a woman is to humiliate him. Right? Think about it in terms of college frat party jokes. If you've ever seen, you dress up like a woman and you humiliate the pledge, right? This is what is going on here. Okay. So I'm getting into the weeds. I'm going to get us back out. All right. Greenberg thus argues that the verse means to prohibit a narrowly defined act of violence and humiliation. What is left open and unlegislated by these verses then are the sort of sexual relations that occur without violence or humiliation, but are marked instead by intimacy and love, care and commitment. In other words, holiness. Right? All the things that are forbidden in the Torah, in the Leviticus verses about forbidden relations, are the kind that are marked by violence, humiliation, or some sort of power dynamic. They're not loving, consensual relationships. Okay. Now, the second person I wanted to bring in is Rabbi David Greenstein. He's actually up in Montclair, New Jersey. I've worked with him. And he also argues, and he was the dean of the Academy for Jewish Religion at the time that he wrote a lot of these things. He looks very closely at the grammar. This is where I get excited. Okay, similarly looks at the words in the verse and similar words used elsewhere to interpret the verse to mean something very different than what it may seem to mean. Much like how eye for an eye really means monetary damage. To Rabbi Greenstein, it's this word et, this teensy-weensy little 2-letter word et, which can be a meaningless placeholder for the direct object sometimes, but can also mean with. In modern Hebrew, if any of you have modern Hebrew in your lexicon, when you say, I want the book, you would say, I want et the book. You put this little word in. It means nothing, but it signifies that the is coming. You would say et ha. In biblical Hebrew, there are times when it does the same thing, but biblically it also can mean with. So we typically interpret this line. Let's take a quick look at it. This et as being a signifier of et, like the book, right? The et zachar and the man, like the man, don't lie with the man. There's the direct object. He's making the case that it's actually a time where we should use the word with. So that changes how you read this verse. So if you think that this word et just is a placeholder and doesn't mean anything, you say with a man, he says, don't lie with a man as you would lie with a woman. How does his interpretation, making it a with, change it? Stay with me, everyone. Here, with. Thus, right here, the et zachar means that a male is the direct object of the act in question. Instead, it does not mean that. It means, and with a man, you should not lie with another man. So what does this mean? Based on the verse below, he asserts that mishkavei isha does not mean lying as one does with a woman, as we traditionally read the verse. Rather, it means more simply and directly lying with a woman. Therefore, if you take them together, he translates the verse as follows. It's a little tricky. Told you it's a little grammar. I love this stuff. His translation of the verse is this. And along with another male, you shall not lie in sexual intercourse with a woman. He is making the case that this is not a verse, even as Greenberg says that it's coercive sex. He's saying it's gang rape. He's saying you and another guy should not lie with a woman. Thus, he concludes there's no prohibition of homosexual acts of any kind. This is actually violent intercourse against a woman. Now, I like this interpretation because of what he's doing with the grammar, but it is a little bit of a strong statement. But it does go along with the rest of the part of Leviticus where we're learning things you shouldn't do to women. Every other single prohibition is about a woman until you get to this line when we traditionally read it against men. If you change it to mean with, you've now made it another thing you shouldn't do to women. Get together with another man and forcefully have sex with her. So the Torah prohibits two males from joining together to force intercourse against a woman. Okay, that's his take on it. He's also Right. And his reasons for this is that here, if you look at this verse from Numbers, now therefore slay every male among the children, and slay every woman who has known a man carnally, but spare every young woman who has not had carnal relations with a man. And this is because you have mishkav again here, mishkav zachar. Wait for it. Mishkav zachar here means relations with a man. So up at our verse, Greenstein is saying Mishkav Isha can't mean lying as with a woman. It has to mean lying with a woman. Because if Mishkav Zachar, lying with a male, the parallel is this, Mishkav Isha, lying with a woman. So he's making a case that when that phrase comes together, plus the et, that this verse is not at all about having sex with another man. It's about how you treat a woman. And here, again, he takes this to mean that if you, with et zachar, with a man, lie with a woman, the two of them are liable. He's saying that this line supports that reading. If a man lies with a male, no, that's not what it says. If a man with another man lies with a woman, the two of them have done an abhorrence, meaning the two men have done an abhorrence. That's his reinterpretation of this verse. Okay. Both of these guys, Greenberg and Greenstein, these two rabbis, interpret these verses to prohibit coercive sexual acts. Rabbi Greenberg's is homosexual coercive act, while Rabbi Greenstein's is a heterosexual coercive act. Greenstein's interpretation narrows the case, while Greenberg's, sorry, I do this every time I try to teach this. Greenberg's interpretation narrows the case down to coercive gay sex. Greenstein's reading reads it non-literally. He's doing the more of the eye for an eye thing. Both, however, are doing what we've done for centuries, using this tiny little drill bit, not knocking down the wall, to be able to make halachic change. So I love these two guys for this because I love the play of the grammar. I love that they are using what is a traditional source, a traditional way of reading our sources to get to the kavod habriot that we started with, to get to a way to say that two consensual, loving, non-violent, non-coercive people of the same sex or gender identity can be in a loving relationship, which is what we want, which is the end goal of how we do our Judaism. So, but there's some other ways to read this. Rabbi Dan.
Less grammatical.
Less grammatical.
This is from Jacob Milgram's commentary on Leviticus. He has a section on every series of laws, and he says, "Does the Bible prohibit homosexuality? Of course it does." He takes it as a given. He disagrees with the earlier things, but his take is the prohibition is severely limited. Milgram is recognized as one of the great scholars, secular scholars or with the secular approach on the Torah, especially Leviticus, in the 20th century. Says, but the prohibition is severely limited. First, it's addressed only to Israel, not to other nations. That's the beginning of the chapter. Second, compliance with this law is a condition for residing in the Holy Land. That's also the beginning of the chapter, but is irrelevant outside of it. The third, it's limited to men. Lesbianism is not prohibited. That's incorrect to apply this prohibition on a universal scale. So he'll say that, look, it's a narrow group, and that's his take. This next paragraph is the one that, in fact, I find most fascinating, and actually that of the things that we've just discussed that I personally find most convincing. It says, moreover, as pointed out by my erstwhile student, Dr. David Stewart, Milgram writes, both occurrences of the prohibition, and I typed this in wrong, 1822 and 2013, I entered the text wrong, contain the phrase, as one lies with a woman, an idiom used for only illicit heterosexual unions. As one could argue that carnal relations are forbidden only if their correlated heterosexual unions would be on these lists. For example, the Bible lists in the followed prohibited relations: nephew, aunt, grandfather, granddaughter, stepmother, stepson, etc. Thus, according to this theory, nephew, uncle, grandfather, grandson, and stepfather, stepson are also forbidden. This implies that the homosexual prohibition does not cover all male-male liaisons, but only those within the limited circle of family. However, homosexual relations with unrelated males are neither prohibited nor penalized. This actually I find most convincing because both instances of our verse occur in the lines of prohibited sexual relations, which I'm going to list off to you even though you may already know it. So it begins with that line, those lines I said at the beginning, like, don't be like the Canaanites, don't be like the Egyptians, do the mitzvot that I do. Then it says, you cannot sleep with your mother. You cannot sleep with your father's wife. That's obviously presuming that your father is not at this point in time married to your mother, second wife, whatever it might be. Then you cannot sleep with your sister. You cannot sleep with your granddaughter. You cannot sleep with your step granddaughter. You cannot, or your stepsister. You cannot sleep with your aunt, paternal aunt. You cannot sleep with your maternal aunt. You cannot sleep with your aunt by marriage. You cannot sleep with your daughter-in-law. You cannot sleep with your sister-in-law. You cannot sleep with a woman and her daughter. You cannot sleep with. You cannot marry two sisters. You cannot sleep with a woman who is menstruating. You cannot sleep with your neighbors. You cannot sleep with your neighbor's wife. And then you get our line. So he's saying that the line is essentially saying all of those prohibitions I just said, not with the men either. Don't think that just because I said you can't sleep with your sister, you can sleep with your brother. Don't think that just because I said you can't sleep with your aunt, you can sleep with your uncle. Just all of the lyings of a woman that I just told you not to do, don't lie with a man either. Those people you can't do. I listed all the women, and it counts for the men as well. This is a close contextual read. And for me, it's if one wants to get out of this, which is again sort of like the presumption of this class is like, what do we do with this troubling verse? This actually is the one that stays within the text. To me, is easily understandable, fits within the context, and as it were, provides an escape hatch. So that.
Ooh. Are you suggesting that the other two reads don't do those things? Ooh, are we having a rabbinic smackdown?
So then the conclusion to, and this is in addressing Rabbi Sisi's question, there are three main conservative Jewish uppercase C positions on this. One is that of Rabbi Joel Roth, who has written extensively and eloquently on essentially saying, alas, I think it's prohibited by the Torah, and there's nothing you can do about it. He doesn't think it's a moral issue, doesn't think that we should be, insulting people or degrading people or like all of these, or like the culture war aspect of it. It's like, this is just one of the mitzvot in the Torah. It's just one of those things you have to do. It's like not eating pork. There's just nothing we can do about it. So, and in it, he actually takes a issue with, among other things, with Rabbi Greenberg's position, that the first one that Rabbi Sisi noted, and he, to me, convincingly, like brings Roman writing saying that no, they had consensual same-sex relations, and it wasn't that when the rabbis, at the least, who knows what the Bible thinks, but when the rabbis conceived of this, they were aware of co-equal relations, and he thinks that the verse in question doesn't have the negative valence that Greenberg assigns to it.
So I'm gonna argue with you on that, just because, I mean, just for the sake of like parsing this out, not because I'm arguing with you, by the way, but like that again, I think what Greenstein is doing on having read more of his work than what's quoted here is that he's doing a similar thing to what Milgram just did, which is Milgram just said all of these things are about women. Don't do them to the male relations in your family. I think Greenstein's saying the same thing. He's saying He's saying all of these things have to do with women, and what they have in common is coercive power dynamics. Don't do that to men either. So I think he's doing a similar thing. He's just doing it in, I think, a way that's more comfortable. The other piece about the Canaanites and trying to distinguish ourselves from them, yes, maybe Roth has disproven that. But I think the other piece still stands, that what we're trying to say is all these things that are prohibited for women, don't do them to men either. Don't use sex as a tool for power and control.
In which case, it's a narrow read, that these are often read as prohibitions on homosexual acts, meaning gay behavior. And all of these sort of like do option one when we talked about different options of how to read the Torah. They're all doing sort of what the rabbis did, which is to narrow the read so that it applies in areas that are, as it were, no longer morally troubling. Instead of prohibiting all gay behavior and saying that you have to be celibate or be in some loveless, sexless marriage or whatever it might be, like those sorts of things, it's saying no, these are just the same prohibitions that exist on heterosexual individuals. So in essence, that's part of what many are looking to do. Roth feels unable to do that. He finds none of these arguments convincing. That's one position. The next position that these are all based on papers from 2006. Rabbi Elliot Dorff and Daniel Nevins and Avram Israel Reisner wrote a paper on that permitted gay relations and essentially took a line of saying the Torah prohibits one specific act. It prohibits anal intercourse between males. Reads the line straightforward, says that this is what it's saying. That's what the lyings of women are. That's what it prohibits. There's nothing you can do about that. That's in the Torah. You can't just pull out, mitzvot, or you can only do it in super extreme situations. All the other prohibitions, though, on any other sort of gay sexual behavior, those are permitted. And certainly sexual behavior between two women, that's permitted. And in a sense, there's no, those rabbinic mitzvot, we can uproot, just because rabbis can uproot mitzvot from other rabbis, and you can't do it willy-nilly, and you shouldn't do it lightheadedly. But here, where we have a moral issue of like having people lead basic dignified lives, or being in situations where they're sort of like condemned to a lonely life, like here, where we have a moral issue, we can certainly uproot all of those rabbinic prohibitions. So they do that. They leave one prohibition on the books and take up all the others.
Right. Which I will say, and I sort of alluded to earlier, just for the sake of, the conversation on this, that it's unsatisfying, because you are doing the hate the sin, not the sinner, saying that it's not it's a tolerant but not welcoming approach to the two gay guys who are sitting in front of you saying, Rabbi, we want to be members of your congregation, right? Or we're gay and we want to be rabbis. That was where a lot of this came up when I was we were in rabbinical school when this was being decided and played out on the, if at the time that I entered JTS, you could not be openly gay or lesbian and be admitted as a rabbi or cantorial student. So what happens then is if you take the Nevins, the DNR Teshuvah that Rabbi Dan is referencing, and it's basically saying, we won't ask you what happens in your bedroom, but there's this feeling of, you don't have to lead a celibate life. You can be married to a man, or you can be with another man, but you can't do these pleasurable acts. And so for many, that's not satisfying, which is why in some cases, there's a case that's been made that maybe this is a place for that third option, where you tear down the wall, where you do akira, because, keep it in the bedroom. We won't ask about what you're doing in there, perpetuates shaming of an individual in a same-sex relationship. So that's where there is an argument to be made for a larger halachic tool than what even our movement has approved. And because what you're doing there is, if kavod habriot that we started with is the end goal of this, and by the way, what I'm arguing right now is a more liberal approach than what our movement has adopted, but if kavod habriot and not shaming those individuals is your end goal, you're not thinking about a theoretical legal case, but people's lives, right? So the implication is the very essence of their souls that makes them who they are. So there is a case to be made for, maybe this is a place where we say, this piece of Torah no longer serves what we know the world to be, and we need to rip it out, right? Remember that piece that I taught you when we were looking at that? Better that we take out a letter of the Torah, then allow the divine name to be defiled. And there's a case to be made that the shame that a same-sex couple feels when they hear that they can't be who they are, that might be defiling God's name. So it's a radical approach. It's not necessarily the conservative one, but it's a halachically legitimate argument to make.
And a version of that is the third position mentioned before, of a paper that did not end up being approved by the law committee by Rabbi Gordon Tucker. That was closer to the neighborhood that Rabbi Sisi just said, where he said that, look, when there's a moral issue, we should feel powerful enough to uproot verse in the Torah and just say that this is a dead letter, and not go through all the gymnastics and just say that we're going to do it. So it's longer and much more eloquent and well thought out than that, but it's closer in that direction. That wasn't one of the official positions taken by the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. They approved by equal majority votes, one individual vote for both of them, the position that that we just discussed, a more permissive one and a more restrictive one. Both went on the books in 2000. I'm going to conclude this. Take questions first. Where are we going? There we go.
And we'll see what Gabe has. And don't forget, if you have questions, put them in the chat. And I haven't been looking this time. I know I looked a little during the. Okay.
So we did have. Oh, you're just concluding first.
I'm conclude, and then you're going to tell me, Gabe. Can someone mute him? Just kidding. Our curator over there. So just as by way of summarizing, Rabbi Eliezer said, "Let the honor of your fellow be as dear to you as your own." This is part of the frame that we're putting around this idea that, we don't want, like, there's such a value put on this loving of our neighbors. Yes, people can do things that are unforgivable. There are punishments in the Torah too, but our way of moving in this world should not be one of suspicion, not be one of hatred, not be one of casting aspersions on each other and judging us for our acts. This is and if you read the law, this is why I do love all of the three things we've brought between Greenberg, Greenstein, and Milgram. I love this idea of reading these laws through the lens of what is the way that is going to honor human beings with the most impact. Secondly, this other piece from this Tashma, this come and learn from the Talmud and Brachot. So great is human dignity that it supersedes a negative commandment of the Torah. Now, granted, they mostly applied these to rabbinic prohibitions rather than the ones that are Torahitic, but the idea behind it and the philosophy of it still stands, right? That there's this idea that human dignity, kavod habriot, is so important. It pushes out of the way all of these, much like saving a human life, doche, like that's the verb that is used. Saving a life pushes out, like, is more important, that supersedes. Saving a life supersedes Shabbat, right? You can break Shabbos to save a life. Same here. To a certain extent, you can break a negative commandment in order to preserve human dignity. And again, mostly biblical, not the biblical ones, but the rabbinic ones, but still this idea, it's a beautiful concept to think that our tradition values human dignity. And there's a case to be made that in a world where we now understand that there are loving homosexual, gay, queer, whatever relationships out there, that it's not just a coercive way of punishing and humiliating another man, that this is something that is loving and part of being a human being. And what if all you need is love, right? If it's all about love, it's all about kindness and love towards each other, and let the honor of your fellow human and their love be dear to you like it is to yourself. Judge them with a favorable lens as you walk through this world, and keep that dignity above everything else. And so, with that in mind, we work very hard to not only be tolerant of gay and lesbian individuals and bisexuals and everyone else, not only to tolerate, but to welcome, not tolerance, but acceptance, but welcoming and embracing. And this is a tricky one for us to look at Jewishly, but there is room and cases to be made that there are tools in our halachic toolbox that allow us to preserve the dignity of all human beings, regardless of orientation or gender.
Are you ready for questions?
Adkan, yes. That's a Rabbi Joel Roth thing, by the way. Adkan.
So there was a question earlier that you guys focused on Leviticus chapters 18 and 20, but we're wondering about an issue from Genesis of Onan and spilling seed. And anyone want to talk to that?
Yeah. Rabbi, I can do it. You can do it. So Onan's sin was a very specific kind of spilling of seed. Onanism being a euphemism for masturbation is not, and the idea that you're not supposed to masturbate or spill or have gay sex because all seed is meant to be used for procreation is not exactly how that story goes down. That story goes down as one where it's a story of levirate marriage, where the woman in the story's husband has died. His brother is supposed to marry her, and through the brother, that man is supposed to have children, and the children get attributed to the dead brother. And that what Onan did was specifically refused to take on the role of the levirate marriage of his being his brother's surrogate. So the seed was spilled in the sense of he wouldn't step up to do the duty to make sure that his brother's seed became children and progeny. So again, it's not meant as a catch-all for all spilled seed is bad. It is specifically in this case where his job and his duty was to take care of his brother's progeny and seed in the metaphorical way was not lived up to. So again, it's kind of like when we say sodomy and we throw that around as a term for anal sex. Sodomy was a very specific penetrative raping situation. Onanism is a specific case where he did not fulfill his duty to his brother.
But for the looking at the chat, like if the question vis-a-vis the prohibition on lesbian behavior, is it because there's no seed spilling? That I think is somewhat less the case, meaning that again, I think the frame is no penis, no sex. That's just where they are. In terms of seed spilling, they don't love it, as it were, but they're okay with all these things that I normally don't get to talk about. They're okay with ejaculation in non-procreative places, right? Meaning that in marriage, they're not they don't necessarily love it, but the rabbis will permit, well, essentially any sexual act. So there's 100 Jewish
Kedarko and Kilo Kedarko, yeah.
They any sexual act that but like within a marriage that the couple wants which would by definition include seed spilling, right? So that so that seems to be less the issue, and
right, particularly because yes, it's the lesbian. I'm looking at the chat now too. That it's not an issue of they didn't forbid lesbian acts because of that, because the seed spilling wasn't really on their radar in the way that it's been back read onto their radar, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I feel like that's that's one of the like sort of Jewish urban legends is that seed spilling is prohibited, and sort of like the answer is like not so much, that they didn't care much about.
It was referring back to a very specific issue, incidents of levirate marriage not being fulfilled.
And for procreation is also like not an issue. Again, like the rabbis obviously permit marriages that with of a fertile man to an infertile woman, right? For whatever reason, like that's permitted. They're clearly the purpose of sex is not merely procreative. They're okay with non-procreative sex.
And I think that's a Puritan American thing that's been read onto us as well, I think.
Right, yeah. It's sort of like people read the Bible back onto the Bible. But different, that's sort of the whole thing. People read the stuff differently. So yeah, that's not it. Those aren't halachic problems, at least.
Were there other things in the chat, Gabe?
No.
No, it's not like
there might be
Shabbat.
questions now.
It's not like music on Shabbat where you talk about it. So look, others?
I don't see anything. I was just looking.
Yeah, there weren't any others. I've got plenty, but
Oh, Gabe, you have questions.
yeah, I was wondering. So there's a lot of focus on the negatives here. There's a little bit of focus on the positive: love your neighbor as yourself, human dignity. I was wondering about not good for man to be alone. How does that fit into things?
I think that informs a good question. I think that informs the human dignity issue, which is to say, we're focused on the negatives because that's the focus. I sort of feel that like the whole thing like feels very heavy, and that's because we have this long history with this verse that is that's painful. And if it were painful 300 years ago, it would be less of a big deal. But obviously, it's still playing out across our society and across the world today. So part of my goal, at least, and to a certain extent our goal, is to was to try and I was rolling with the assumption that people's guts are that they want to be able to say it's okay, but there's this weird thing that the Torah says not to, and sort of like to give everyone ways to hold both at once, both your ethical self and your our love for Judaism and the tradition. This is like a way that we can both do it. For the positive, not good for man to be alone. That's the human dignity part of it, right? Like that part of a human life is at some level having the opportunity or having the hope, or for people who find a besheret, as it were, to be able to live the life that we allow for each other, and that's the love your neighbor as yourself aspect. Like that we all sort of get to do this, and it's not a blanket thing. Like there are prohibited relationships. It's not for it's not that everything is okay, but yeah, I think the not good for men to be alone like feeds into it. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add to that. I mean, when you're saying that people, you're starting the assumption that we want to find a way to make this sort of work in our worldview. The other piece of it is that this is something that often drives people away from Judaism, right? There are, for better or for worse, there's a lot of a focus on the don'ts. Like Shabbat feels oppressive when you take away the oneg and the enjoyment of Shabbat and you only focus on what you cannot do. Similarly, people turn away from Judaism or Jewish community when they have the impression that the Bible tells you you can't be gay. And either you are gay or you are someone who believes that gay people are totally fine, and that doesn't sit well with you. So part of my sort of mission in life is to make sure people know that there's a way to read the Torah authentically Jewishly and still hold the dignity of gay and lesbian individuals, LGBTQ people, in hold their dignity in a high regard. So I mentioned that I worked for Congregation Beit Simchat Torah for 2 years. The reason that synagogue existed is that people were not like Rabbi Dan and I sitting here saying that gays and lesbians are welcomed into our community as full participants. They were shamed, and that synagogue existed because the people who didn't get turned away from Jewish community sought a Jewish community where they could be their full authentic selves. And that's why there was a gay men's synagogue that met secretly in the papers. And so you had this feeling that people really needed community. And I'm not in the business of turning people away from Jewish community. I want people to be in Jewish community. And again, I want to make it clear that I haven't ripped those lines out of the Torah in order to make this work for me, which is a legitimate approach, right? Reform Judaism says, that line doesn't work for us. Being B'Tselem Elohim, being in the image of God, Kavod HaBriot, all this stuff is what we go on. That's the end of the conversation. That's not what we're saying here. We're saying here that there is a legitimate halachic way of saying, well, wait a minute, actually, we're uncomfortable with this verse and we want people to live in community. So I want to also just sort of honor that it's not just about us trying to make it work. It's about people really being hurt and really being driven away from Judaism and Jewish community in a way that I spend most of my waking hours trying to tell people, no, you know, God's love for you is a Jewish concept. Gays and lesbians are welcome in Judaism. Shabbat is about things you can do, not things you can't do. So it's this positive spin on it. So yes, we did a lot of the negative, but we have to sort of chip away at that as part of the thing.
And if you have other questions, feel free to ask. If you have ones that you're not comfortable asking out loud or don't want to put in the chat, feel free to contact us. We're around for this, and again, like to Rabbi Sisi's point, like the part of the idea of all this is to find ways that we can continue to read Torah and engage deeply with it, and make sure that we're not checking our values at the door. If we ultimately aren't loving our neighbor as ourselves, or if we're doing something that we think is immoral, then the idea is that we're reading Torah wrong. And the conservative approach, again, isn't to chuck it and say that, well, we don't have to pay attention to that anymore. And it's not, ultimately what we're doing here is it's too aggressive for mainstream orthodoxy, right? To say that, well, even these mitzvot of the rabbis, we're not going to follow anymore. It's a uniquely conservative approach, and I think the one that it's what we have to do, like hold on to our values and hold on to our tradition and make sure that they're both strong enough to move forward. If we fail to do that, we've failed to do a lot. And like this is one of the places where those potentially come into conflict, and we just wanted to present different perspectives on how we are able to make sure that they don't conflict and that we can all, again, find ways to live with dignity. Feel free to contact us. Thank you for coming.